Hi, thank you, Kathy, for inviting me to speak today on this topic. Like Kathy said, my name is Victoria Polchinski. I'm a lead UX researcher with Enterprise Technology, and I'm here today to talk about designing for everyday accessibility. I see some familiar faces in the Zoom room, so some of you might have seen some of my previous talks. I've given very similar presentations on design for accessibility for UX designers, for UX researchers, for data visualization, and I've given kind of some hybrids for front-end engineers and designers. I was previously, before becoming a researcher, I was a UX designer, so user experience designer, and I've also worked as a UI engineer. Today's agenda, we'll go over everyday accessibility, what that means, what that looks like, and then we'll get into some more specific design type topics. So we'll talk about color, typography, writing, images and multimedia, and we'll get into some closing thoughts and resources. I will have the chat open on the other screen, and I'll try to monitor that. But if anyone has questions as we go, please feel free to come off mute and interrupt at any time. Give me a breather, or just post in chat, and I'll keep an eye on that. So a note about the language in this presentation: person first language puts the person before the diagnosis. So for example, a person with a disability, and identity first language puts the person's disability as an identifier. So for example, a disabled person. When possible, ask people how they prefer to be described. And for the purposes of this presentation, I'll be using person first language. Okay. So getting into everyday accessibility, I wanted to start with a poll, and I don't think I can launch it from what I have. So instead, if you can just write in the chat, think about just your day-to-day work life. What is some of the content that you create on a daily basis? And I'll put some of mine in as well. I know I write a lot of Slack messages. Feel free to come off mute. Anyone, what sort of content do you create? Promotional content, emails, PowerPoint presentations, email, Slack, course material, slide presentations. Yeah, spreadsheets, yep, graphical material, Canvas pages, social media posts, web components, course assignments. Awesome, yeah. Slides, graphics. So I'm seeing a lot of LibGuide, Slack, email slides. Seeing a lot of content that many of us are probably familiar with. I'm guessing at a minimum, most of us create emails and/or Slack messages on a daily basis. So when talking about everyday accessibility, what is that? What does that mean? So while some of you on the call probably are professional designers or content creators, kind of seen that way with what some people put in the chat, we're not all designers and we're not all content creators, but we all make design and content decisions each day that impact accessibility. So everyday accessibility is about all of the emails, the Slack messages, the social media posts, Canvas posts, documents, and more that we create each day that make everything more or less accessible. And why practice everyday accessibility? So there's definitely more than just the 3 reasons listed on this slide. But first is to make our workplace and/or our classrooms more accessible. We don't always know who's going to be consuming our content and what sort of assistive technologies they may use. And even if we do know who's consuming our content, and maybe we know what sort of assistive technologies they use, one day, another day they might be using something else. Or maybe they go from not using any assistive technology to then, in the future using something. When we also think about onboarding new people, if we have a person who's using a screen reader, for example, and a lot of our content isn't accessible to a screen reader, so even all of our Slack messages, when you think about coming into a Slack space for the first time, and maybe, poking around, seeing what sort of messages are there, those are other ways that we can make just the onboarding experience more welcoming for everyone. Sorry, I skipped ahead there. So it's also helpful for keeping accessibility in mind through continuous daily practice. So a lot of times when we think about accessibility, I think a lot of it is related to what we can or shouldn't post on the web. But if we're doing all of these things on a daily basis, and we can really keep it at the top of our mind, when we think about accessibility more, I think we're more likely to speak up about things that aren't accessible on projects or areas where we think accessibility can be improved. And then, yeah, just gonna look over to the chat. I see some chats coming in. Adero posted that we can improve our ability to communicate with diverse people. Absolutely. So I think everyday accessibility is important for the employee experience. If you're also thinking about if you're recruiting, how accessible are your recruiting materials? So we'll kind of talk to some of that throughout this presentation. And then Renee posted that even if we know what assistive technology our audience currently uses, we can't assume that they will always be of the same ability. So thanks Renee for paraphrasing. Yeah, so for sure. So just thinking about accessibility and how we can apply it to our day-to-day work. This is also great for developing our accessibility knowledge and skills, which may also have a positive impact on our core job. So if you are a designer, if you are a professional content creator, the things that you do every single day to make the web more accessible can then come back and really help with your job. So just accelerating your ability to easily create accessible content in your day-to-day. All right, so getting into color. I think there's really two big web content accessibility guideline or WCAG tag rules I tend to talk about when it comes to color. The first is text, graphical objects, and UI components must have sufficient contrast between the foreground and background. And then the second is not to use color alone to convey meaning. Many people on this call are probably familiar with the contrast ratio checker from WebAIM. The general requirement and rule is that normal text, which is 18-point regular text or 14-point bold, the requirement is that the contrast ratio is 4.5 to 1. And for graphical objects and user interface components, the requirement is a 3 to 1 contrast ratio. I will open this up just for anyone who hasn't seen this before. You can come in and you can grab a different hex value and it'll return the contrast ratio and state clearly if it passes or fails normal text, large text, and graphical objects and interface components. So this is something that I often share with people who are new to accessibility and aren't quite sure if things pass contrast ratio standards. Okay, so next poll, people who have been in previous presentations are probably familiar with this one. But for the first question, does this text pass or fail contrast ratio requirements? Please feel free to just give your best guess in the chat. We have maroon background with gray text. Fail, fail, probably fail, it's too close in shade, fail. Yeah, hard to read. Fail. Cool. Okay. The second one, any thoughts here? Does this one pass or fail? We have brown text on a very dark gray background. Getting lots of fails. Have a pass. A couple passes. Yeah, so fail, I'm still having trouble reading. Yeah, so a few mixed opinions here. And then for question 3, we have medium gray text on a dark gray background. Any thoughts here? Does this text pass or fail contrast ratio requirements? Yeah, that's the hardest to read, fail. I've seen lots of fails. Is it just me? Yeah, so Renee, you're right. Like these are all very difficult to read. When we think about accessibility, a lot of times we really rely heavily on the WCAG rules, which are important for compliance. But I also think it's important to think beyond beyond the WCAG accessibility compliance, and also realize that passing contrast ratios are not always accessible. So things can be technically accessible, but it doesn't mean that they're actually accessible and that they're easy to read, they're easy to consume. And so when we think about our content creation on a day-to-day basis, I like to use this exercise to illustrate just because something passes, it doesn't mean it's good or it's the right design choice. So the W3C does recognize issues with the current contrast ratio formula and is planning updates to this formula for WCAG 3. You can also use tools like the color contrast.app to check accessible color combinations. So yeah, we had a lot of mixed thoughts about, well, we had most people thought the text failed. And I do agree that these are all very difficult to read, but they do technically pass. So this tool, this color contrast.app tool, you can take the same colors that you would put in the webbing tool and put them in this tool and see whether they pass or fail. So this might be something to keep on hand if you're not quite sure. And the other thing is, if you're not quite sure, maybe just err on the side of caution and make some different design decisions so that everyone can easily access your content. Sean asked, would that be better to refer to than the WebAIM one? In my opinion, yes. Just if you want to future-proof things, the nice thing about the WebAIM is that is technically the standard. I think if you want to go above and beyond, you can start using a tool like the color contrast.app. The other thing is WCAG 3 isn't technically published yet, so they might make changes to this. With WebAIM, you could also just aim for things that are AAA compliant, and then that might put you in a safer zone. And then Campbell said, what about color blindness, red, green, etc.? What about something like color contrast checker that is also checks brightness and grayscale? Yeah, so I will get to those. Great questions. I will get to those in just a moment. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about color here. This simulator also does, or sorry, this contrast checker also does do some simulations as well. But I will talk a little bit more about the color blindness in a minute. And then Renee said, can you share whether the last example passed AAA and the WebAIM checker? So are you this brown one, the brown with the dark gray here? Okay, yeah, the gray on black. No, that was so these, if you're in the, like, I want to say AAA, Kathy, you might know off the top of your head better, but I believe that's 7:1 contrast ratio is for AAA text. So things that are in the like 4 or 3.76, that's not going to pass.
Yeah, but we only have to comply with A and
right.
AA. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll get back to some of those other color questions in a moment. I also created this contrast grid for ASU colors. This is I think just kind of a handy tool if you want to see all of the ASU brand colors and what passes or fails at a high level. This is something that you can come in and edit yourself to make it your own. So if you don't want to have all of these options here, you can delete them and it'll just automatically remove those. You can also make the grid larger to make it a little bit easier to read. Just to kind of give you an overview of how to use this. So here we have ASU Maroon and this is the ASU Gold. This shows kind of an example of what text will look like, what the gold text will look like on the maroon background. And then it'll state whether it passes AAA, AA requirements. The A18 is for bold or large text or graphical objects. And then the 5.6 here, that's the contrast ratio. So the key is down here just to keep that handy. And then you can also, like if you want to filter everything by AA or AAA, you can click on these show buttons down here to make that happen. And then I'll also mention, just because we're using brand colors, it doesn't mean that we're using them correctly. So I would also recommend cross-checking ASU's brand presentation toolkit, which also talks about accessible color combinations that also meet brand standards. So a couple different resources to help you just kind of at a glance grab some accessible and brand compliant colors. Okay, let's see. Okay, so kind of like I was mentioning before, those 4.5 to 1 contrast ratio is a minimum standard for regular text, and using just passing colors can lead to failing scenarios. This is probably more true if you're maybe a designer and you're constantly kind of playing around and making slight modifications to the different colors and backgrounds, the color text and the backgrounds that you're using. But one example is that for ASU brand standards, we have like a kind of a medium darkish gray, which passes contrast ratio standards on a white background. But as soon as you put that same color on a light gray background, it fails the minimum standard. So just be cautious about doing things that just pass, because it's really easy to just accidentally get into that kind of muddy middle where it's like, does this pass or doesn't it? And just like the other example with that poll where a lot of people thought things failed, if you avoid that, like, you know, those areas around the fours, you're more likely to have things that pass compliance and are also easier for everyone to read. And then the last little bit I'll talk about on color contrast is UI components and graphical objects. So UI components such as form fields and graphical objects such as each line in a chart require a minimum 3 to 1 contrast ratio with adjacent colors. Accessible data visualization is a super complicated topic, and so I'm only going to touch upon it here, but if you're interested in learning more, I do have linked in this presentation another presentation I did on accessible data visualization if you're interested in learning more on that topic. For this example, this pie chart has 2 points of contrast failure. So with charts, each adjacent color needs to be accessible. So the team 1 really dark gray pie slice and the team 2 maroon pie slice, they fail this contrast ratio standard. And then the team 2 and team 3, this maroon with the adjacent pink color, also fails. The pink and the black pass, so that's a passing. And then each one of these pie slices also needs to be have enough contrast with the background. So it's a white background, so that passes and is compliant. A really simple fix here would just be to, if you still wanted a pie chart, would be to add a white line, an outline in between each of these pie slices. You could also think about doing using a different type of chart to illustrate this where you wouldn't need these touching adjacent colors. Okay, so why not use color alone to convey meaning? And we'll kind of talk a little bit about some of the questions that were asked in the chat as well. One of the reasons is about 1 in 8 men and 1 in 200 women have color vision deficiency, CVD, or color blindness. It seems as though the term CVD is more people who identify as having CVD or wanting to use that term, color blindness can be a little bit misleading. So on the left here, we have a stacked bar chart using red and green categories. And on the right, we have a stacked bar chart using those same red and green categories with Stark's Zoomtopia, I always struggle saying that, CVD simulation. So I will just kind of give a quick demo of this simulator. I have it as a browser plugin. I do want to note that simulations are not perfect. So it's not exactly what someone will see, and people may also have more than one sort of, like they might, for example, have a CVD and also have low vision. So it's important to think about having multiple disabilities and how that might impact your content design decisions. So if we go over here, we can have this vision simulator, and this just simulates different options. They also have things like blurred vision, ghosting, things like that to help give you an idea of whether or not the colors you're using might work with different color vision deficiencies. And then the other reason not to use color alone to convey meaning is that devices, environments, and settings also impact color rendering and perception. So on the left, I have an image of the Fuchs Mira e-paper monitor, which displays in grayscale. This is also relevant for print material. So if you create presentations for, let's say, course material, and your students like to print things out, it might be important to, especially important not to use color alone to convey meaning. When I first came to Arizona, I just loved working outside, but what I quickly learned is that it's not a very easy thing to do. I think you can kind of get away with like typing on maybe a plain Word document where there's a lot of contrast, but just your environment can really impact color perception and contrast display. On the far right, I have a screenshot of Apple's color filters. So people can also use their device settings to change color display. So we never really know how people will be perceiving color. And so that's why it's, especially important to make sure that we're not using color alone to convey meaning. Yeah, so it's important to consider like the multiple factors that you have when considering color. So we need to think about contrast, but we need to also think about, are we using color alone to convey meaning? And if so, how do we get around that? Okay, I'm gonna move on to typography. So this one's pretty straightforward. With capitalization, I just avoid using all caps. So all caps can reduce word readability, and it can also cause screen readers to read the word as an acronym. This also aligns with ASU's brand capitalization standards, so another good reason to not use all caps. On the right, I have an example of a sighted user might see "Hello World" in all block text, but a screen reader may read HELLO, so they may read the entire word or sets of words aloud by each letter. And then the other thing is that the shape of "Hello World" using proper case has a more easily distinguishable shape compared with the all caps version. So just avoid using all caps when communicating in your day-to-day content. Text alignment. So this one, again, is pretty straightforward. Do right align text and don't justify it. Justifying text creates these rivers of empty space running down the page, which can make the text difficult for some people to read. So I know I've also talked to designers that kind of like that really like blocky look of justified text, but I think it's really important to prioritize readability and people's ability to easily consume content over just like, if you stand back, maybe you think the justified text looks better. So related to font size, There are no WCAG rules around default font sizes, so consider context and then the following default. What I typically see people use for the web is a minimum of 16 pixels, or the equivalent of 16 pixels. I won't get into like too much about don't use pixels if you're publishing to the web, but if people have questions, I'm happy to answer them. I just don't want to make this too technical a conversation if I'm not quite sure who in this room might want that. And then for presentations, I tend to see for body font a recommendation of 18 to 24 points. And a lot of times that's against some of the default body font. So you may have to, use a different template or just enlarge the font. I think when thinking about font size, it's especially important to think about the context. So how are people going to be viewing your presentation, for example? Are you going to be in a large auditorium where there are going to be people in the very back? You might want to err on the side of larger font sizes. So I know I've been in big spaces before, and I can tell the font is probably like 11 point, and there's so much text and you can't read any of it. So just think about the context when selecting font sizes. Another thing related to typography is the font style. Underlined text is a common pattern for links. So use underlines for link text only, not to emphasize text. This is something, a lot of us didn't learn about accessibility in school. And so this is something where we don't always know these things. So a lot of times I'll see text emphasized using an underline, which makes it seem clickable, even if it's not. So consider using something else to emphasize your text. It's also important to note that not all screen readers will read bold or italics text emphasis aloud. So it'll just kind of read it as though it's the rest of the content. So if it's really important to kind of emphasize any text, you might want to just call it out in writing. So say something like important note, or have some other way of calling it out. And then don't use fancy fonts. Use simple fonts. Arial is the ASU brand approved font. I know it can seem fun to like play around with these different types of fonts, but really it's just making things more difficult to read. Not everyone has these fonts loaded on their machines either, so it might not render correctly for everyone. So just kind of keep those things in mind when thinking about your font styles. Okay. Any questions before I move on to writing? Keep going. So for writing, you want to make sure your writing is clear and concise. So write in short, clear sentences and paragraphs. Avoid using unnecessarily complex words and phrases. Expand acronyms on the first use. So for example, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, abbreviate that as WCAG. I think this one's especially important for when you think about just when people come into ASU and they're new, and a lot of people think that like it's like learning a whole new language, and there's so many acronyms, and it's really easy to sort of forget like that experience of being a new employee, being in a new place, and not knowing what all of these things mean. So you can save people the time of asking the question or thinking that they should know something, or Googling it and finding an acronym that's like not actually the correct use of the acronym. So this one I think is just, it's a pretty easy one to do. It's to just define the acronym on first use, and then use applications like Hemingway app or Grammarly to check grammar, fluency, and sentence structure. So over on the right, I have an image of the Hemingway app default screen that shows reading level and highlights different writing issues. So these are free tools, really handy to use, and I think we all appreciate reading things that are simpler and clear and concise. So this is just a good general practice. And then related to headings, so use short headings to group paragraphs and clearly describe the sections of those paragraphs. You can make headings descriptive to give users an overview of the site content and organization, and then don't skip headings for styling reasons. So over on the right, we have an example of headings used in a Word doc. I think using headings in Word doc is just a really helpful, a Word or a Google Doc is just a really helpful way of getting familiar with headings, getting better at writing headings that work really well. What I often see people do, which is a really avoidable, logged out, which is just very avoidable, is they'll have a document and maybe they create a heading 1, but they don't actually like the way heading 1 looks. And so instead of using heading 1, maybe they use heading 2. They get to heading 2 and they're like, I don't like the way that looks. And so they'll use a heading 4. And then the heading structure is just all mixed up. So if you don't like the way something looks, just go ahead and go in and you can change the way it looks and then make it the H1, and then you can just say update heading 1 to match. So then when you go in and you create another heading, it'll be consistent throughout your document, and you can do this for each one of your heading styles. But just make sure instead of skipping the different headings, you're keeping the structure correct and consistent so that it makes sense and it's a logical structure. Let's see, readable is also, just checking the chat, readable is also a great comprehension checker. Thanks, Renee, for that recommendation. And Renee also says in Word, it'll be in the styles panel. Awesome. Yeah. So yeah, I think in Word, it shows pretty easily as like a default in the styles. So just make sure you're not skipping those headings. Okay, hyperlink text. This for me is like a really big one, and I think it's a really easy one to incorporate into your day-to-day practice to make your hyperlink text better and more meaningful. So meaningful hyperlink text allows screen reader users to generate a list of helpful links. Links also stand out for sighted users, so meaningful hyperlink text helps all users understand where they may go next. So really, really common examples here are things like click here, view more, learn more, here. These are all examples of hyperlink text without any context. So one example just in practice might be something like class registration is now open, click here to register. Where something with context might be something like class registration or loan application or flu shot, where you see that hyperlink text and you know where you're going to go next. So class registration is now open, where class registration is the hyperlink is a way to modify that so that you don't have to say click here. And on the right, I have a screenshot of Window Eyes link list where all links are click here. I don't think Window Eyes is really like a screen reader that's used very often, but I just really like this example of it's just a list of 27 links. All of them are click here. And if someone's using a screen reader where they're navigating something by links, they're not going to have any context here. So this is just an area where I especially recommend like practice this one, get better at making those meaningful hyperlink texts and just learn more. Just avoid the click here and view more and learn more. It's actually like harder to do than you might think until you start to practice. Talking a little bit more about hyperlink text, I'd also say avoid using plain URLs. This URL is not too ugly, but we've all seen those like super long URLs. This will often read as HTTPS : so you kind of get the idea. it's not the easiest thing to listen to. Whereas if you use the meaningful text again and you say class search, it'll read as class search. Okay, so with writing emojis and hashtags, so use emojis sparingly and group them together. Don't repeat an emoji over and over. So I'm gonna go ahead and play this. Please let me know if you can't hear.
Didn't hear anything.
Thank you. Let me see. I can hop over to Zoom.
Do you have earbuds in?
I do.
Yeah, that's probably why.
Okay. I thought there was a way to play it with earbuds.
I think you'll have to stop share
Okay.
and then share with sound.
Thank you. It's always harder to, yeah, there we go. It's always harder to figure out on the fly. All right.
I didn't know you could do that. Share with sound. I keep that in mind.
Yeah, let's try this again.
Red heart emojis, beaming face with smiling eyes, grinning face with big eyes, face with tears of joy, grinning face with big eyes, grinning face with big eyes, grinning face with big eyes. But let's keep them down, waving hand because they are very annoying, weary face, dizzy face, person gesturing no for screen reader users, smiling face with halo, baby angel, light skin tone, baby angel, medium dark skin tone, baby angel, dark skin tone, baby angel, medium skin tone. Relieved face, folded hands, here no evil monkey. Frame I red heart emojis, beaming face.
Okay, so that was kind of painful to listen to. I played the whole thing to kind of give you a sense of how painful that can be to listen to. So that's one reason not to repeat an emoji over and over, and then not to use emojis throughout a sentence. So adding those emojis in made it really difficult to understand what that sentence was saying when listening only to the sentence. And then just don't use emojis to replace text. So while maybe the visual is easy to understand, it might not be so easy to understand with just the emoji. Yeah, Adero says, I tried to use one emoji at the end of a complete sentence. Yeah, so in prepping for this, I also read that it's best to use it at the end of a sentence, which was also something I wasn't familiar with. So there's definitely, yeah, sometimes in Slack, if you roll your cursor over an emoji, yeah, it does show a text description, which is also nice to get a sense. Yeah, so how would we know what it, yeah. Yeah, so that's, let's see, Renee, just to answer, I think Campbell answered your question down there about how you would know in Slack how a emoji may read. And then for hashtags, use camel case for hashtags where you capitalize the first letter of each word. So this is important if you post on social media. It could also be important if you are, maybe you're a researcher and you code open, like open text responses, for example. You may want to think about how you tag things so that it's easier for everyone to read those things. Okay, so images and multimedia. Kathy has posted a lot about February being alt text month, so you all are probably pretty familiar with some of this alt text, but for one, most images need alternative text that provides the information or function of the image. For purely decorative images, there's no need to write alt text, but the alt tag is still required, and you can leave that blank. Practice writing alt text in your daily work, so use tools like Microsoft PowerPoint Check Accessibility feature to highlight missing alt text. This is another one, kind of like hyperlink text, where I think there are a lot of instances where we use images in our day-to-day work, and we may not always write alt text, but writing alt text can be a really helpful way to practice writing alt text more and just to kind of develop that skill. So this image and the equivalencies are from the ASU accessibility website, where an equivalent content for the image might be ASU football fans, and equivalent content might be football stands filled with ASU students yelling and give them the fork and the devil's hand sign. I think alt text can be just one of those kind of tricky things to learn and grow and do better, but that's just another thing that you can practice in your day-to-day and just kind of figure out a style that works well for you, and then consider using tools to kind of help identify where you should be using alt text. And then talking about animations a bit, just wanted to mention cautious use of animation is important for people with vestibular disorders, epilepsy, migraine sensitivities, and cognitive disorders. So consider leaving animations out of presentations and avoid animations on a continuous loop. So I didn't want to add an animation to this presentation, but if this block of text were an animation, you would have no way to stop or pause the viewing of the animation while viewing this presentation. So that's just something to keep in mind when creating presentations. I know animations and things can make presentations feel more fun, but just think about how you might be able to do that in a way that doesn't cause issues. And then with videos, many are probably familiar with this, but use captions on all of your videos. Consider including transcripts as well. And just to learn more about this, I recommend going to the W3C audio and video guidelines, and then also ASU's video captioning guidelines to learn more about making your videos accessible to all. Luckily, this seems to be getting easier and easier with just making sure transcriptions are available. They're now defaults in a lot of video services, but if you're using a video service, just make sure that it does have transcripts and things like captions to make things accessible. And then also transcripts are helpful for pure audio and podcasts. Yeah, for sure. I know I've been interested in the content of things like podcasts and just kind of been able to scroll through and read instead of listening, and videos without any sound. Yeah, I know a lot of times I will be in an environment where maybe I forget my headphones and can't play, or for a long time the headphones I was using I couldn't hear very well out of, so the transcriptions and the captioning always helped a lot. Okay, so for some closing thoughts and resources, this presentation reviews some of the ways to incorporate accessibility into your everyday work, but as always, there's still so much to learn. So here are a few tips for incorporating accessibility into your everyday practice. And the first one is to just be proactive. So maybe you establish a habit goal to learn more. So for example, you spend the first 10 minutes at the start of each day learning something new about digital accessibility. And maybe that's not the right goal for you, but maybe you block out 30 minutes on your calendar every Friday and you just read about digital accessibility and get into more advanced and niche topics. One of my favorite ways to learn is to learn as I go. So look up accessibility best practices as you write new emails, write alt text, design a presentation, etc. Sometimes these accessibility rules seem really simple on the surface, but then when you dig into the details, they become a lot more complex. And so learning about those things can help with just thinking about what's the context, what's the best way to approach this for this scenario. Fix accessibility issues. So a common one I see is just little things like not enough contrast in an email signature. You might want to go back and look at your documents and think about, can I use correct headings or just add headings so that there's more structure to the document? You can run accessibility checks on your presentations and more to just kind of go back and see, like, do you have documents or parts of your everyday content that aren't as accessible as they can be? And then just to share with your team. So share what you're learning with your team members, help each other grow. If you onboard employees, you might want to think about kind of sharing information like this in your onboarding materials so that people are thinking about accessibility and incorporating that into their day-to-day when they get started. And just kind of talk and discuss. I think the more we talk about accessibility and how we can make our work more accessible, it's always top of mind, and things do become more accessible when we're constantly thinking about them and thinking about how to improve. I do have a small list of resources here and some Slack channels and communities that you can join. I'm sure most of you are already in the Accessibility at ASU channel. There's also the Global Ally Slack community. This is a really small list of resources, but the links will take you to hundreds of other resources based on your learning needs and preferences. So thank you, everyone. Please feel free to stick around. I'm here to answer any questions. If you can't stick around, I'm also happy to meet, or you can Slack me or email me to just talk accessibility. Always happy to talk about this subject.